Africa is unlikely to meet this year's forecasts for maize production. Dry weather conditions have delayed plantings, and possible frost at the end of the season may also hurt crops. The harvest this year is expected to be 19% lower. What impact will this have on food prices? Agricultural economist Wandile Strobo joins us now to discuss this and more. Wandile, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. Well, I mean, maize is the main staple food for millions of South Africans. What are the implications of this?
No, thanks for having me on. I mean, look, the 19% decline that we were mentioning is really going to be on the area plantings so far. That's what we're estimating at this point. But in terms of the output on the production side, we yet to really see on that number. But I think as a country, as you rightly say, millions of South Africans depend on the maize side. If we get a harvest of at least about 8 million tons or so, I think we will be relatively at a comfortable level, given that we still have a fairly good stocks of over 3 million tons that we'll be coming with from the previous season. But obviously, in terms of pricing, I think that on the food prices, we will see a bit of an uptick. We're already now seeing plus 30% increase on the maize prices. But what I would say is that at this point, we're not really at a crisis level. We're seeing a bit of an increase on pricing because of that delays in planting. But I think we will have a fairly comfortable supplies to take us through the 2019-20 marketing year.
Are you saying we shouldn't worry that much?
No, I think we can be worried given that at this point we're still at the early stages, but we shouldn't worry much, as you rightly say. We have a bit of a supplies, but I think where the impact will really largely be felt is also on the agricultural side, on the guys that are on the ground to say, okay, if they get poor harvest this year, what will actually be happening on the health of the agricultural sector? I think that's where the concern will be. But the other point that I might put on the table is the fact that this is not all widespread. It's largely the western side of South Africa, Northwest and Western Free State. But when you put your eyes on the Eastern Free State and you look at Mpumalanga, Eastern Cape, KZN, the conditions are not really exciting, but the crop is looking relatively better. And I think that will balance up when you add the stocks from last year. So we're not at a crisis mode, but obviously the dry weather condition have had a negative impact so far on the farming side, and we'll be watching the next months on what really happens.
Is the problem due only to situations of, factors that we have no control over, or could better planning actually mitigate what we're seeing?
No, I think it's really the factors that we have no control over. Because if you were to look, for example, on the tractor sales in South Africa, the guys, it seemed that they were really planning on and going on and farming and farm big this year. For example, if you were to look at their intentions to plant, farmers have intended to increase the area planting for all crops by roughly 5% on a year-on-year basis. And then also that was followed by actions on the tractor sales that I was mentioning for the first 11 months of 2018. They were up by roughly 5% also on a year-on-year basis. What that tells us is that there was momentum on the ground and people thinking that they will go back on planting. But obviously the weather didn't play on a favorable side, which is what now we're sitting with some decline on a hectarage on the western side of South Africa, Western Free State and Northwest.
But has our industry caught up with international best practice and also, very modern and newer ways of doing things? Are we there?
No, we are there. Look, we are. If you look at the South African agricultural sector, we have one of the most modern farming sector in the continent. And I mean, even if you're now not comparing with the continent and you look globally, what the practices that you see when you visit the farmers in Iowa, when you go to Australia and everywhere, that's what you see if you go to the heartland of South African side. So in terms of best practices, in terms of the available technologies that we're sitting with, we are there. But obviously, one would add to say, given given that now climate change is becoming a real challenge for the agricultural sector, for the world at large, then obviously now one has to ask a question to say what sort of technological developments that we can come up with going forward that would enable us to cope with these tough conditions that we are having. And we are somewhat seeing a bit of that from the seed developers, where they're coming up to breed seed varieties that would grow at a relatively shorter time period, so that if rainfall doesn't come for a longer period, we can still be able to get produce. So those are some of the technologies that are yet to come in the market, but we're already seeing some evidence of some stuff happening. But as per to say, is the South African agricultural sector really modern, coping on with working with the best technologies and adopting best practices that are seen in the world? I think that at least the commercial sector is right there. But obviously, if you're to look at the smallholder sector side of the country, we still have a lot to improve on that end.
Is anyone accepting now the fact that global warming is real and it affects them directly, or are there still doubting Thomases there who may not be doing their businesses any favor?
No, I think that if there was many people learned from the 2015-16 drought, because before that, obviously, folks were not really coming up and saying, no, climate change is a hoax. But obviously, some certain practices were not yet in line with the climate-friendly practices, for example, conservation, agriculture, and all of the agri-smart ways. But since then, we started to see people really increasing and doing a lot of that, particularly on the grain and oilseed sector. So I think folks are seeing that climate change is a real stuff. And I mean, if you were to look South Africa, for example, just generally historically, we would typically get a drought, and then we would have roughly about 4 years of a good run without much of a drought on the dry spells. But now it's starting to occur more frequently. In 2016, we had this dryness, and then it's just been a few years now, and we are still feeling another pinch. And in Cape Town, we had another pinch in the Western Cape last year. So folks are seeing these changes, and I think that they are adjusting their production practices in that way. Even the seed development that I was talking about, that is it's going to be coming on the market. The seed developers are doing that because the folks that are using their products are somewhat demanding that. So there is a clear understanding that this is a serious challenge, and I think that folks are working towards it.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave it, Wandile. Thanks very much for your time and insights this evening, agricultural economist Wandile Sihlobo.